Hello and welcome. My name is Samuel Bilton. My prayer is that this video would be a blessing to you and that it would help equip you to build your life on the Word of God. What does it mean to walk like Jesus walked? What would Jesus do? It's a saying that became so popular that even the non-Christian world is familiar with it. The non-believer and the believer alike might say this to mean, what is the nicest or kindest thing to do in this particular situation? Obviously, what would Jesus do should mean a whole lot more to us than just that. There is a group, however, known as the Torah observant or Hebrew roots movement. They use this familiar saying and, in particular, a verse found in 1 John 2:6 to teach that every follower of Jesus should be following all the commands given to the nation of Israel through Moses at Mount Sinai, often referred to as the Torah. This group is made up of primarily non-Jewish followers of Jesus that believe and teach that Torah observance is at least a desired fruit in the life of every believer. This includes things like keeping Shabbat, eating kosher, keeping the feast days, and circumcision of males. There are a few key texts and catchphrase arguments that you'll hear presented regularly, and this is one of them. 1 John 2 verse 6 says, "Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked." So a Torah observant will say, see look, Yeshua followed Torah, and we are to walk as Yeshua walked. Case closed. We are to follow Torah because Yeshua did. As I mentioned, this movement is made up of almost entirely non-Jewish believers and those that were followers of Jesus before they encountered a Torah observant ministry, and then they were pulled in by one of these various hooks. And this is a hook that I've heard often. Here's some examples of some popular Torah observant teachers fishing with this one.
You might ask then, what commandments did our Messiah keep? What instructions did he follow and teach? Did he keep the Lord's feast days and Sabbath? The dietary instructions? The answer? Yes, he did. Absolutely. He had to have practiced and taught what Moses wrote. Otherwise, our perfect Messiah was actually not perfect and he sinned, thus rendering us lost and hopeless. Just in case you might be wondering which commandments John was referring to keep in the test of knowing him in verse 3, John immediately stated that he was referring to the same commandments that Christ walked. 1 John chapter 2, verse 6. He who says he abides in him ought himself also to walk just as he walked. The question is this: are you going to walk as he walked, or walk as others tell you to walk? You might say, but Paul said this, or Paul said that. Well, who died for you, Paul or our Messiah?
Most biblical scholars and historians agree that Yeshua lived his life as a Torah-observant Jew. He rested on the Sabbath every seventh day, he celebrated Passover and all the other biblical feast days, and he didn't even eat unclean animals. Yeshua himself told us not to even think that he came to abolish the Torah. In Matthew 5, he said that nothing from the Torah will pass away until heaven and earth pass away and all is fulfilled. You know, it's interesting that even the word Christian literally means follower of Christ. And 1 John 2:6 says that we as Christians ought to walk as Christ walked. Since Yeshua walked according to the Torah, shouldn't Christians do the same?
These are just a few examples. Every ministry that teaches Torah observance that I've found puts forward this argument at some point. And it might sound logical, maybe even biblically reasoned. I've also heard it put like this: if it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. However, there are a number of problems with this argument. The first and most obvious is that this idea isn't actually found in the text. The Torah isn't even the topic in 1 John. In fact, John doesn't even mention Torah in his entire letter. John designed his letter to be poetic, and is to say the same thing in many different ways, rather than presenting his instruction in a linear 1 + 2 = 3, but instead he uses a well-known technique in ancient writing called amplification, in which you see the same thread woven through his letter, all coming back to the same core idea. If we back up just 2 verses from the much-loved verse 6, we'll see 2 more examples of John trying to get across the same idea. How do we know if we are right with God? How do we know if we are in Messiah? 1 John 2, 3-6. And by this we know that we have come to know him, if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. In other words, we know we are in a relationship with Jesus if we are obeying what he taught us, if we keep his commands and walk like he walked. Again, the Torah teacher will say, see this, his commands. Those are the commands of the Torah, and we walk like he walked by keeping the Torah. The problem is, this isn't what Jesus said or what John is saying at all. If John was trying to say, you know that you are followers of Jesus by coming under the Sinai covenant and are following all the commands given to Israel through Moses, he would have said that. He's quite capable of saying that if that's what he was trying to say. But you won't find that in his letter, or anywhere for that matter in the New Testament, because that's not what the Bible teaches. What does Jesus command then? You won't find anywhere in the Gospels where Jesus is teaching to eat kosher, keep the Sabbath holy, or about the purity laws, circumcision, etc. Now, I'm not saying that Jesus didn't keep those things, or that he told his Jewish followers not to do those things. Not at all. But we'll come back to that later on. The point is that we don't have any record of Jesus reteaching those aspects of Torah during his ministry. What then is his commandments that John is speaking about? How do we walk like he walked? Well, thankfully John tells us, and we're not left guessing or needing to insert ideas into the text like we see these Torah teachers trying to do. 1 John 3:22, because we keep his commandments and do what pleases him, and this is his commandment, that we believe in the name of his Son Jesus Christ and love one another, just as he has commanded us. John tells us what his commandments are, to believe in Yeshua and love one another as he has commanded us. And how did he command us to love one another? Well, again, we don't need to guess and we don't need to assume, because he told us. John 13:34 says, this is Jesus speaking, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. And you also are to love one another. This is a new commandment. The Torah taught people to love, but Jesus commanded us to love as he has loved. There is no higher standard of love. This is a love that can only come from a transformed heart, which is only possible through the new covenant that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection brought in. And a new covenant came a new commandment. And this is the new commandment that John is talking about. This is how we walk like Jesus walked. We believe in his name and we love like he loved. These Torah teachers rightly point out that it says in Deuteronomy 4, verse 2, that no commandments should be added or taken away from the Torah. However, the problem that they face by claiming that the outcome of Jesus coming to earth and dying to bring all Jesus followers under the covenant made with Israel is that here we have Jesus very clearly giving a new commandment. And he's not adding to the Sinai covenant in order to do that. He's bringing in a new one by his blood. In Luke 22, verse 20, Jesus said, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. When Jesus rose from the grave, the Sinai covenant was brought to an end. Hebrews 8 verse 13 says, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. The scriptures teach that the law was given as a guardian until the coming of Messiah, Galatians 3:24-25. And now we have a new high priest who is Jesus, Hebrews 7:12. When there is a change in the priesthood, there must be a change in the law as well. Coming back to a comment that I made earlier, I obviously agree with these Torah teachers in the point that Yeshua kept Torah. He was a Jewish man born under the law, Galatians 4 verse 4 says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law. And why? It says in verse 5, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. Not only was Yeshua born under the law, or Torah, because he was Jewish, but he was the only one to ever keep it perfectly, which meant that he could be our spotless lamb, our perfect once and for all sacrifice, and to bring us into relationship with God as sons and daughters. And this is something that the Torah could never do. Continuing on to verse 6, it says, and because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then an heir through God. So when those that want to be under the Torah say, if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me, they're missing the whole point of Jesus being under Torah in the first place. The Torah allowed one priest once a year to go into the Holy of Holies, where he might never return. The new covenant, when we're covered by the blood of Christ and made into living temples of his Holy Spirit, allows us to walk into his presence as his very children. Hebrews 7:18-19 says, "For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. For the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God." So when John says to walk as Jesus walked, it means, according to the Torah, no more than it means to walk from town to town preaching, to take up carpentry, or to never travel more than 200 miles from your hometown. But instead it means what the scriptures say that it means, to keep Jesus' commands of believing in him and walking as he walked, by loving others as he has loved us. In the Old Covenant, the world knew who Jesus' chosen people were, as they were the ones that ate differently, rested differently, circumcised their men. They were known and set apart with these outward signs and acts, signs and commands of the Old Covenant. But what about now? What is the sign of the New Covenant? How will the world know that we are followers of Yeshua the Messiah? By following this New Covenant's new commandment. This is Jesus. "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another." And what is the result of this? "By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." We are the light of the world. This is how we walk as he walked. Don't allow these Torah ministries to shove something into the text to claim that Yeshua taught or said something that he didn't. We know what Yeshua's commands are because he told us. I hope this teaching helped you see the beauty of the gospel in a deeper way, and that it helps equip you to build your life on truth. Shalom.